Today we're going to be doing things a little bit backwards. Normally you would make a quilt and then put on your inner and outer border after you were finished with the body of the quilt. But today I'm going to do things a little bit backwards. I'm going to put the inner border and the outer border on the body of this small quilt first, because on the quilt I'm just going to do a laser cut applique, and it's going to be like riding a bicycle. I'm going to be doing the Merry Christmas bicycle, which is one of 4 different seasonal bicycle patterns that we have. This also comes in 2 different sizes. The larger size, which is what I will be working on, and then there's a smaller size that you could use on a tote bag. But we won't be getting to the applique in this video. We're going to do that in the next video. But I am going to go through the process of putting this 2 borders on. So the quilt originally was going to use this light powder blue as the background, but I was a little concerned that the light blue on the bicycle might not show up on this, so I went ahead and went to a bright white for the background so all the elements will show up. But what I am going to do is use just a little strip of this as my inner border. And the inner border that I'm going to put on this quilt is just going to be a straight border. There's not going to be any mitered to it, so I'll put on the 2 sides and remeasure, and then cut the 2 end pieces and put those on. I did find this batik that I liked as the border of the quilt. It brings out the elements that the tires of the bicycle has, so I'm going to use that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to miter this border. So I'm going to be showing you how to measure for a mitered border, and also how to cut it before we put the borders on the quilt. I'm sure you've seen people put borders on a quilt. They're just long strips, and then they'll fold the quilt and cut the miter after it's attached. But what I'm going to do is get an accurate measurement on our piece and then cut those miters into the corner before I ever sew them onto the quilt. And the reason that I do that is because I like to know that it is exactly the way it's supposed to be and there isn't any excess fabric. So if it isn't lining up when I'm adding it to the quilt or pinning it, I know that there's a problem before I go any further. I have done it the other way in the past where I'm having to cut the miter, but there's a lot of excess fabric, and using the rotary cutter that close to the quilt with pins in it and making sure that it's laid properly is a little bit problematic for me. So I like this method because it's either right or it's wrong, and I know that when I'm doing it, so I don't have to backtrack and do it all over again. So the first thing we're going to do is get rid of our outer border, and we're just going to work with the inner border first and put on our simple border. So the first thing I need to do is measure the exact size of this, which in this case is 31.5 inches by 24.5 inches. So I'm going to iron my fabric and get my first 2 strips cut and attached to the quilt, and then we'll meet you back. Well, I've gone ahead and cut my first 2 strips on the inner border. I've cut these at 1.5 inches wide, which will give me a 1-inch finished inner border. Because this quilt is particularly a small wall hanging, I don't think I would ever put more than a finished 1-inch inner border on it, but that's all just personal preference. I've cut that exactly the same length as the fabric, so what I'm going to do is just get these pieces pinned on here ready to go to the sewing machine. And the way that I would do this is always I would pin the 2 outer edges, and then I would pull the 2 fabrics taut, and then just make sure that they're lined up in the center. And then after I get the 2 ends in the center pinned, then I would just put a couple pins in where I needed. This is a smaller piece, so it really doesn't need a whole lot of pins. sometimes I find when you're doing a really long border that you need more pins actually, because when you're schlepping to the sewing machine to sew, if it's draped too much, it'll get caught on everything and it will pull the pieces out. So I'm going to go ahead and do this to both sides and get that seam sewn. And I should say that I draped my ironing cover in black today just so that my white fabric would show up, because I noticed in the last video when I was measuring the quilt that it was kind of hard to see the white on the white background. So I just draped that on there, so pardon the lint. I've already ironed the top seam on. I sewed both of these two pieces on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so my piece should finish once I have both seams done at 1 inch. I always like to use the iron to top set my stitches. I've always heard that that helps condense that stitch locking and give you a tighter stitch. And I'm just going to push that out, and I'm going to push it with the iron starting at the center. I just want to make sure there's no little micro pleat in the seam there, so that I get an accurate measurement all the way across. Also, you want to be careful with these two ends. It's the two ends that are most likely to get distorted from handling or heavy pressing when you're getting these done. The outside corners always seem like they want to flare out. And so to prevent that, we just want to do smooth motion and not, doing a lot of heavy pushing. So now that we have both of these seams done, we're going to go to the next step and measure across the center to get our length. We know they're going to be 1.5 inches wide again, but this is how I always measure, is from the center body of the quilt, so that the outside corners, if they are getting flared out, you don't add too much border and give yourself a lettuce border. So we'll measure this distance, which includes now the two inner borders that we've sewn on, and we'll cut our strips accordingly and get those ready to pin on and get those sewn. So that will be our next step. By measuring across the center, we have two pieces that are already pinned in place that are perfectly the right size. And I know that I'm not allowing the corners of the quilt to stretch out beyond the size that they're supposed to be, because we know if it's one size in the center, it should also be the same size at the top and bottom. So I have these pinned in place, and I'm going to go ahead and get those seams sewn, and then we'll meet back again. I'm just going to go ahead and iron it, but we'll get to the next point, which will be the mitered border, which will be a little bit more interesting. I'm sure most of you have not seen anything new in this so far, but the mitered border might be a little interesting. I have slipped in my cutting mat on top of the ironing board so we can get some measurements together. The inner border is sewn on. It's straight and even. We have nice square corners. That was good. The measuring on the next step is going to be a little bit more critical because we are going to be cutting our miters beforehand. So one thing I would recommend, whatever type of tool you use to measure and cut, I would kind of make sure that they are perfectly lined up with each other. So if you use a flexible tape to measure, lay that flexible tape right on your cutting mat, and in this case this is lining up perfectly, all of my lines exactly where they should be. Also, you could try that with any of the rulers that you have. Just lay them right on top of your cutting mat and make sure that they're perfectly lined up, because when you measure with one implement and then go to another to do the cutting, you want to make sure that they're perfectly right on. So we've done that, and we're going to go on to the next step. And again, I'm going to measure from the center of my quilt to get the measurement for each side. So I'll find the approximate center, and then I'm going to lay my tape right on top and get the measurement for that unit. And in this case, this is exactly 33.5 across the side. Then I'm going to go ahead and flip this around. I'm going to use the lines on the mat to make sure that this is lined up. And again, I'm going to measure across the approximate center of this quilt to get the side measurement. And I'm even going to use the lines, which I can see through there. In this case, it's 26.5. Oh, of course I dropped my pencil. So when I do my measurement for my cutting, I'm going to use those measurements exactly as they are. I don't need to add or subtract anything because they're not going to overlap where the miter is, so it is going to be cut that size. But what I will say is we have to add the length of the border onto each end because it is a miter. So if I use a 5-inch width on a border, then I have 5 inches at the top and 5 inches at the bottom. So I need to add 10 inches to the length and the width of each piece just to make sure I have enough for the miter. And in fact, I'm probably going to do 11 inches just to give me a little bit of wiggle room. But I'm going to go ahead and cut 4 strips. I think I am going to cut them at 5 inches because that should be okay for this size of a quilt. But also, I always like to have my border be a little bit wider than what I actually want the quilt to finish at, so that after it's quilted, if the edge gets distorted at all, I can do a little bit of trimming on the quilt and still have a good sized border on it. So even if I finished the border at 4.5 or 4 inches on this, I would be very happy, but I'm going to cut 5. I might even cut 5.5, but we'll see when I get the cutting done. So I'm going to go ahead and iron my outer border fabric. Turns out I was really lucky on this fabric. This fabric must have been printed on some really old cotton because it is actually, the width of it is 46 inches. It's been a while since I've seen gray goods 46 inches wide in the quilting world. It seems like they just keep shrinking and shrinking. So I cut my strips 5.5 inches, which will give me some playroom after I get it quilted. And I have plenty of room to do my miters. There's a couple ways that you could have gone about this to get this lined up. One of them, and the one that I chose, I folded the piece in half and put a pin mark in it, and I folded my quilt top in half and I put a pin in that. So what I would do is just line up these 2 pins, and I might even go ahead and swap so that it's actually pinned together now. And I have these in the position that I need them in. I also could have just measured out from each side to make sure that these were equal distance out, to make sure that I have enough room to accommodate the miter on it. But now that I have that pinned in place, I can flip this over and reposition the fabric a little bit. And once I get this in place, I can see exactly where my miter is going to start. I have this point exactly on both sides. I could put a pin in here on both sides and use that for my indicator, or I could use the Miracle Chalk that we sell. The Miracle Chalk is nice because it completely just irons away once you are finished with the mark. So I'm just using the ruler to give me a straight line, and I'm marking my miter point on there. I am also going to use a pin just so I don't lose my place in the whole strip, because it's not a real dark marker. So I can go ahead and remove the pins to start my first miter. I'll put my quilt top aside. I'm going to move this into the middle a little bit. This is where my marking is. So I'm going to take my ruler. We know that a mitered corner is a 45-degree cut, so I'm going to use the 45-degree line on my ruler. I'm going to use the 45-degree line on the bottom edge of the fabric, and I'm going to bring the very edge of the ruler over to my mark. I have to do it from this end, I think. Well, I'm going to have to reposition it after I get it started. So the very tip, this is the exact point of where my miter starts. My 45-degree line is on the fabric, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut that piece off. This is the miter for one side. Now I just want to pay attention when I am cutting my next miter. This one goes this way, so this one's going to go in the opposite direction. So I have my magic chalk mark. I want to make sure that I get this in the right direction. I want to go out. I want to get my 45-degree line. So I have my 2 points lined up again. Here's my 45-degree line, and here is the very tip of my chalk mark. So I go ahead and cut that, and that's my waist off again. And you'll see that I have the miter for one side. When you lay this on top, we'll get that pinned so that it is exactly in place. I would want to make a mark on each of these two pieces that is 1/4 of an inch in and 1/4 of an inch up on each side. That mark is where we're going to stop sewing and stop sewing when we're adding this mitered border onto the project. So I'm going to go ahead and get this pinned in place and put my markings on it, and then we'll go to the machine. I'm trying to do a real close-up of the edge so that you can see where my miter starts is exactly in the corner of the body of my quilt. And also I made a little mark, a little hash mark of my 1/4 inch in on each direction. I did that on both sides because I'm going to put my needle down right on that crosshair and do my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to stop on the crosshair on the opposite end. And I'm going to do this method for all 4 sides of the mitered border, and then when I have all 4 sides on, stopping and starting on each of these hash marks, which will in fact be the same in each direction, then I'm going to go ahead and show you how I fold the quilt and pin those miters together and get them sewn. So I'm going to go and get the next steps done and meet you back right here. Well, I probably will show you on the sewing machine my stop and start. That'll be next. That's what I'll do. I'm going to go ahead and get this over to the sewing machine, but I will have to reposition the camera, so it'll take me a few minutes. But it'll fly by for you. It'll be like a time-lapsed photography. But for me, it could be, who knows, days, weeks, months, but I'm going to get it done. Okay. So I have super close up here so you can kind of see what I'm going to start doing and finish doing. I want to put my needle right down in the center of this cross hatch that I made on the back of the quilt. This is where I'm going to start sewing, and I'm going to finish sewing on the opposite end on its hash mark. This will give me the room for the miter seam allowance when I go to sew those together. So I'm going to get that in position even before I pull my pen out, because I want that dead center. And I have that sewn. I'm actually going to do a couple little back stitches. If I back stitch too far, then I will just use the seam ripper and pull out one stitch. I'm going to make sure I have an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance as I'm sewing this across, making sure my two raw edges are lined up. I'm almost to the other edge. I'm going to pull out my last pin, hold both corners in place, and I'm going to sew very slowly now. I did my last stitch, and I did a little back stitch. Now okay, I have my top and bottom border on, and I have I haven't ironed anything. The border is still laying flat against the body of the quilt, and I've tucked under the one edge. So this piece of fabric here is the top miter edge of the fabric that I'm sewing on now. Because I marked the 1/4 inch on the top and bottom pieces, I don't have to remark that because the marking is already there from my previous seam line. So I just have to get that fabric lined back up and make sure that I'm following my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I can go ahead and get this next seam finished. At this point, this is my third of 4 borders that I'm attaching. And at this point, none of the mitered corners are actually sewn yet. Sometimes if my 2 raw edges aren't lined up, I'll put my hand underneath and I'll be pulling on the bottom piece of fabric to create a little bit of tension so that my 2 edges line up. So I can do it. I can either pull on the top fabric if it's too far over, or I can pull on the bottom fabric to get it lined up. And I think I may have gone off my seam, but we'll see in a second. Again, I'm going to come down to my 1/4 inch seam allowance and then do a little bit of a back stitch. After you get all 4 of your borders on, you can see that the corners are still not sewn. What we're going to do is just fold these over on top of itself and align up these 2 raw edges. Now you do want to be careful because both of these are bias edges, so you don't want to distort those while you're working with it. But basically I'm just going to fold that over, lining up these raw edges here, and you can put a pin in it just to hold it in place. And I like to just lay these on top of each other like that, so we have a perfect joining of these two raw edges. And we're going to start sewing at this seam allowance where we ended on the two borders, using our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and sew down to the edge. I always like to start at this end and move down, just so it works in the machine better. Sometimes if you start with a small narrow point like this, the needle will push it down into the stitch plate. I do have a straight stitch plate on my machine right now, but still I would always start there, just so you have that perfect alignment with your old seam allowance and your new one. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine and get that sewn, and then we'll move to showing you what it looks like. Remember to edit it back into place. Whew, daddy long legs. What I'm going to do is start sewing right where I've stopped sewing on my border seam. So the border seam stops there. That's exactly where I'm going to put my needle down. And I have my two miters, one laying on top of the other, the way I've folded the fabric. And I'm always going to start at this seam where it ended, because most sewing machines do not like to start sewing at a point. I do have a straight stitch plate on, which would help, but I just find that it works a little bit better if I start at the wide end and work towards the narrow end. I don't want to pull on these fabrics too much, because this whole seam is bias, and it would be very easy to distort that. After you get your seams done, then you can come back to the ironing board. At this point I haven't done any ironing on my seams for the miter or for the edges, so this is when I would go ahead and do some ironing. But you can see you get a pretty crisp edge on your miter. The question might be, why would you miter border rather than just the cornerstone of the block? Generally, well, in this case there was no reason to, other than to do the illustration, the demonstration. But sometimes you'll have a fabric that has a linear component to it, and you can get those lines to line up really beautifully, or there's some symmetrical designs that you can get to line up, and that will create a secondary design on the seam. So that would be the plus reasons for doing it. The negative reasons not to do it is because it does use a little bit more fabric, because you do have to have this measurement in both directions added to the measurement of the fabric. Sometimes that could be a factor, sometimes it's not such a big deal, especially today since my fabric turned out to be really wide. I didn't even have to use lengthwise fabric for this. So it's just another skill that you could work on. I have a couple of little stitches right here that are showing. I would probably just go in with a marker and just pop those with a black marker, and those would disappear. But that is the process of getting a miter border done, and in the next video we'll go ahead and put our bicycle on so we can get some exercise. See you next time.